And then I'm also delighted that then we're going to start talking about William Carlos Williams. Yeah, great. So Leslie.
Alrighty. So I was sort of kidding when I said we ought to change to Eliot's lighter side, but after the heaviness of the four quartets, um, it's nice to know that he had a really delight with playing with words, with creating these characters, and he was really inventive with his rhymes and his rhythms and everything. So we're going to start. Tony and I practice screen sharing this. We're going to see if it works. Can you see that?
Yep.
Oh,
Ah,
great. Okay.
Oh my God, that's adorable.
yeah.
Okay. So Eliot always liked cats. Can you imagine him as a 6-year-old embroidering this cat with a ball of yarn?
So cute.
Yeah. Anyway, he also had a great fondness for children. He didn't have any children of his own, but he had a number of kids that were his godchildren. And he spent quite a bit of time with them, and he also wrote them a lot of letters. So let me just come down here. Here he is with some of them. Um, this is the Faber children. That's from the publishers, Faber and Faber, where he worked for 40 years. And Tom, in particular, who I believe became a famous physicist, was somebody that he wrote letters to. And so he made his first foray into talking about cats in a letter to Tom. Let's see, this was 1931. Tom had written to Eliot about his cat, and he said, I'm glad you have a cat, Eliot wrote, but I do not believe it is so remarkable a cat as my cat. My cat is a lily cat hoofsely. Its name is Jelly Lorum. And there followed further letters to Eliot's godson, and he introduced the pollicle dogs and the jellicle cats and the practical cat, um, who were seen. He sent these letters illustrated. This is his letter, and these are the illustrations of this is Eliot being imitated by the practical cat at hunting and fishing and playing golf and tennis and all of that. So that was from a letter in 1936. And he sort of started expanding on that and thinking of these little things he was sending to his godchildren as something that might become publishable. So this is his manuscript of the Song of the Jellicles that I will be reading later on. And he finally his act together. He was sort of unsure about
Okay.
whether or not would float. I think he was generally a sort of an anxious guy, especially about his poetry reputation. And so he started sending these out to adults as well as people at the publishing company to see if if they thought that he should continue with this one. Well, he said, I'm more and more doubtful of my ability to write a successful book of this kind, and I'd rather find out early that I can't do it than waste a lot of time for nothing. And this sort of thing is flat if it is flat. That is more than serious verse. Nobody wants to make a fool of himself when he might be better employed. So he sent these out, and he was getting some pretty positive feedback. And in 1937, they had a broadcast by the BBC on Christmas Day of 5 of the poems from Practical Cats, and it was a great big hit. So that really bolstered his uh, feelings that this might work. And they did 2 more the next Christmas, and they were a big hit. And he was hoping for the publication that Ralph Hodgson would illustrate the first edition, but he wasn't available. So this is Eliot's own drawing for the cover of the book. He did this, and let's see here. This is the copy of the front cover. And there were other editions later. This was from 1939, and then I listed the illustrators for the other editions. I have the Edward Gorey illustrated version from 82. And it was a big success. Actually, he mentioned that he needed the money too. He wanted it to be a success. He said, let's see, where was that quote? Oh, it just said that he saw it as crucial to his own financial prospects. He said, my financial future depends on cats. So he was writing them with the practical cats were written for a practical reason as well. Anyway, there were things, it sold very well, 200 copies a week. And then there were spin-offs. There were musical versions before Andrew Lloyd Webber's version. 1945, a guy named Colin Taylor wanted to set McCavity to music. And actually, his wife, his second wife, said that he had specific popular songs in mind for each of these poems. He sang them to certain tunes that were from popular music. So if they sound that way, I know Anne had mentioned that he liked music hall music. And then 1954, they had 6 settings from Practical Cats at the Edinburgh Festival. And he made the audio recording that we're going to hear him reading The Naming of Cats from in 1957. And they suggested to him, since he had made an audio recording of the 4 quartets earlier, that wouldn't be any problem. But he said, he disagreed. He said, I'm not so sure of that. No, you've got to put a lot of energy into some of those cats. So now to take a look at those, we have to just a second. Okay. I have to screen share over again, so this takes just a second. Okay.
The stairs.
Yes.
Good.
On a second. Wrong one. Just a minute. I don't know where that page came from. Let's start again. Stop share. Okay. I have no idea why I got the calendar on here. Okay, now we should be okay. Screen share. You can't share the screen unless you make it the big format. Okay. Let's see, we've almost got that. Can you guys see that whole page? Can everybody see that?
Just the top of the page.
Just just the top.
I'm gonna scroll down as we go.
Okay.
Okay, this is going to be the naming of cats. And the reason I had to make it that size is I'm trying to hit the recording without making you listen to the YouTube ads. So that's my excuse. Hold on just a second. Okay.
The Naming of Cats. The naming of cats is a difficult matter. It isn't just one of your holiday games. You may think at first I'm as mad as a hatter when I tell you a cat must have 3 different names. First of all, there's the name that the family use daily, such as Peter, Augustus, Alonzo, or James, such as Victor or Jonathan, George, or Bill Bailey, all of them sensible everyday names. There are fancier names if you think they sound sweeter, some for the gentlemen, some for the dames, such as Plato, Admetus, Electra, Demeter, but all of them sensible everyday names. But I tell you, a cat needs a name that's particular, a name that's peculiar and more dignified. Else how can he keep up his tail perpendicular, or spread out his whiskers, or cherish his pride? Of names of this kind, I can give you a quorum, such as Monkastrap, Quaxo, or Coricopat, such as Bombiliorina, or else Jellilorum, names that never belong to more than one cat. But above and beyond, there's still one name left over, and that is the name that you never will guess, the name that no human research can discover, but the cat himself knows and will never confess. When you notice a cat in profound meditation, the reason, I tell you, is always the same. His mind is engaged in a rapt contemplation of the thought of the thought of the thought of his name, his ineffable, effable, effing ineffable, deep and inscrutable singular name.
Okay.
Great.
So, anybody have anything they want to say about that so far?
Yeah, I'm definitely going to rename my cat.
Yes. Okay. So I want to tell you a little bit about his names of his own cats. Let's see, where did I have that? George Pushdragon, Noily Pratt, Vermouth, Petty Paws, Tantomile, and Whiskus. Those were a few names of his own cats. And he had a really good time coming up with the names of the cats that are characters. There are 15 poems in the collection. And the cats have names like Jenny Any Dots and Growl Tiger and Grumbuskin and Tumble Brutus, Grittlebone, the Rum Tum Tugger. And then there are types of cats like Jellicles, and there's Mungo Jerry and Rumple Teaser, and the Mr. Mistopheles, McCavity, Gus, that's a shortened form of asparagus, and the character Friar for Fiddle, the Fiend of the Fell, and Bustopher Jones and Skimble Shanks. So I think he was really, just enjoying the sounds of the words. I was just going to read 2 of the poems as examples. Whoops. Okay. This is the Song of the Jellicles. And apparently, Jellicles were a cat version of Pollicles. There's the Pugs and the Pollicles. He wrote one of the poems is about dogs, and originally it was going to be a collection of poems about dogs and cats. And then he decided to just focus in on the cats. But he has one about Jellicles, and the Jellicles basically means the poor old dogs, and the Pollicles um, are the sweet little cats. So he was I wondered if it was a shortened form of angelical. I'm not sure where he came up with it. Okay, here's the Song of the Jellicles. Jellicle cats, come out tonight. Jellicle cats, come one, come all. The Jellicle moon is shining bright. Jellicles come to the Jellicle ball. Jellicle cats are black and white. Jellicle cats are rather small. Jellicle cats are merry and bright and pleasant to hear when they caterwaul. Jellicle cats have cheerful faces. Jellicle cats have bright black eyes. They like to practice their airs and graces and wait for the Jellicle moon to rise. Jellicle cats develop slowly. Jellicle cats are roly-poly. They know how to dance a gavotte and a jig until the jellicle moon appears. They make their toilette and take their repose. Jellicles wash behind their ears. Jellicles dry between their toes. Jellicle cats are white and black. Jellicle cats are of moderate size. Jellicles jump like a jumping jack. Whoops, and wait for the jellicle moon to rise. They're quiet enough in the afternoon. I'm sorry, in the morning hours. They're quiet enough in the afternoon, reserving their terpsichorean powers to dance by the light of the jellicle moon. Jellicle cats are black and white. Jellicle cats, as I said, are small. If it happens to be a stormy night, they will practice a caper or two in the hall. If it happens the sun is shining bright, you would say they had nothing to do at all. They are resting and saving themselves to be right for the jellicle moon and the jellicle ball. So I sort of like his tongue in cheek. I have had several what I consider tuxedo cats who were jellicle cats, and they'd sit around all day and do nothing, maybe clean between their toes. And it was nice to know that what they were actually doing was saving themselves for their nighttime dancing. Okay, and then this one, McCavity, is based on Sherlock Holmes's archenemy, Moriarty. So some of this will sound familiar. McCavity, the mystery cat. McCavity's a mystery cat. He's called the Hidden Paw, for he's the master criminal who can defy the law. He's the bafflement of Scotland Yard, the flying squad's despair, for when they reach the scene of crime, McCavity's not there. Just a second, I lost a line. Okay, McCavity, there's no one like McCavity. He's broken every human law. He breaks the law of gravity. His powers of levitation would make a faker stare. And when you reach the scene of crime, McCavity's not there. You may seek him in the basement. You may look up in the air. But I tell you once and once again, McCavity's not there. McCavity's a ginger cat. He's very tall and thin. You would know him if you saw him, for his eyes are sunken in. His brow is deeply lined with thought. His head is highly domed. His coat is dusty from neglect. His whiskers are uncombed. He sways his head from side to side with movements like a snake. And when you think he's half asleep, he's always wide awake. McCavity, there's no one like McCavity, for he's a fiend in feline shape, a monster of depravity. You may meet him in a by-street, you may see him in the square, but when a crime's discovered, then McCavity's not there. He's outwardly respectable. They say he cheats at cards, and his footprints are not found in any file of Scotland Yards. And when the larder's looted, or the jewel case is rifled, or when the milk is missing, or another peak's been stifled, or the greenhouse glass is broken, and the trellis past repair, aye, there's the wonder of the thing. McCavity's not there. Oops. It's going too far, sorry. And when the Foreign Office find a treaty's gone astray, or the Admiralty lose some plans and drawings by the way, there may be a scrap of paper in the hall or on the stair, but it's useless to investigate. McCavity's not there. Second. And when the loss has been disclosed, the Secret Service say, it must have been McCavity, but he's a mile away. You'll be sure to find him resting or licking of his thumbs or engaged in doing complicated long division sums. McCavity, there's no one like McCavity. There never was a cat of such deceitfulness and suavity. He always has an alibi and one or two to spare. And whatever time the deed took place, McCavity wasn't there. And they say that all the cats whose wicked deeds are widely known, I might mention Mungo Jerry, I might mention Griddlebone, are nothing more than agents for the cat who all the time just controls their operations, the Napoleon of crime. Okay, so anyway,
That's
those are
wonderful.
a few samples because the whole time I was reading, the heavy stuff in the four quartets, I was thinking there was also this guy in the picture. It was sort of fun.
That's really fun. My favorite thing is the picture of all the little kitties climbing the ladder.
I know, I know.
Hysterical. That's adorable.
Uh, so he had many sides. He apparently played the mandolin and
Mhm.
he drew his own covers and he wrote funny letters to kids.
Yeah. Sweet.
Right. So thank you for my
Thank
little.
you. That was great. That
I
was
have
wonderful.
I have a couple of questions. Mungo Jerry is a band.
I
Was
know they had a list, Tony, of all the things that the names had been taken from the Book of Practical Cats, and that was one of them.
that so they got the name of their band from this poem?
Right.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
The other
Ellie
thing,
lives on.
have you ever heard of a book called The Areas of My Expertise by, I think it's John Hodgkins or something like that?
Mhm.
He has a list of hobo names that
Mm.
goes on for about, there must be at least 100 of them. And they are at least as hilarious as these poems. But the areas of my expertise, I couldn't put my hands on it, but it's worth the price of the book just to read the hobo names. I don't know, maybe my sense of humor is off, but I can't read four of them without lying on the floor and laughing. Anyway, that's that. But I didn't know Mungo Jerry. Did you say there were other bands or other things named
Well, there were
after this?
other things like names of pubs and stuff like that. They had a whole list of all the things that were taken from, that became part of the culture based on these names.
There's
Oh,
a certain amount of I think Dr. Seuss is a takeoff of this as well. Didn't she have that sense of the kind of the whimsy and the rhymes and the internal and the end of rhymes as well? In some of them it's real interesting, because it's so engaged, it's like these are all obvious rhymes, but you just sort of delight in them.
yeah.
Yeah, he made some up. And another thing I didn't mention too much, I mean, like McCavity is obviously based on the Sherlock Holmes character, but in the other ones, he's not only talking about cat qualities because he had a lot of cats, but he's making fun of human qualities. Like you have um, Bustopher Jones is this. He goes from club to club, dining at every club and getting fatter and fatter. And you have the Gus is a sort of a washed up actor, and so he goes to the bars. He hangs out in the bars, and he's always telling everybody about how these young actors nowadays don't know what they're doing. They haven't been put through their paces, and then he goes into how he was fired for Fiddle, the Fiend of the Fells, and that was the key, cat acting role. And so there's a lot of good satire of humans that he knew as well.
Don't you love to think about the nation of England sitting around listening to the BBC on Christmas? And now we have T.S. Eliot. Yeah, I think that's wonderful. That's great.
After McCavity, my favorite is Growl Tiger's Last Stand.
Yeah,
The pirate cat.
yeah, yeah. That's funny. Yeah,
Well,
you,
I really enjoyed these, and it was kind of like a relief to know that he could be so lighthearted, and because his other poems, I just was worried about him as being so lonely and so depressed. It just was nice to see that he had this other side.
yeah,
It's rather sweet, I think, that they're for his godchildren. I think in the Anglo-Catholic tradition, that's a very serious responsibility. But it's nice that his approach to it was this very sort of sweet, creative, really engaged with the children. I would guess that some of the poems might even have been inspired or directed or of particular interest to specific kids.
Mhm.
I can imagine the Rum Tum Tugger, for example, who's never quite satisfied. When he's in, he wants to be out, and when he's out, he wants to be in.
There was something I just found a few
A
minutes before we started, that they had found some unknown letters of his that he had written to one of these godchildren, and they were among her effects, in a cottage in the attic. But it was fun. He said, when a cat adopts you, there's nothing to be done about it except to put up with it and wait till the wind changes. And he sent her a minor opus, spelled Opuss, of a unpublished poem called The Practical Cat,
Hmm.
a feline that goes up the flues, goes down the drains, and keeps in order boots and shoes, tidies the pillows and counterpanes. But it was also funny that when he sent them letters, these people lived in Hope Cottage, he would address it as Hopeless Cottage, Hope, 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 Hurrah Cottage, Hope Against Hope Cottage, Faith, Hope, and Charity Cottage, etc. So he enjoyed playing with words.
Yeah, that's great.
I
And so
really,
think about the cat in Prufrock, the cat that, circles around the drains, circles around the buildings, and then falls asleep. That's a sort of a more grim version of this cat that goes up the flue and down the flue and tidies the beds and so on and so forth. That's pretty cool.
I guess one thing I'm amazed at is how many people saved all these letters, and how really wonderful it is that we have letters that he wrote, letters that people wrote to him, that people kept letters. And I look around my house and think, oh my God, look at all this paper, all this crap. But I know a bunch of you have been watching, like me, have been watching Ken Burns' series on the Revolution, and there are letters in there that people saved that
Mhm.
from 250 years ago. And on the one hand, I'm thinking, I don't, I mean, I don't think anybody's really going to be interested in my letters 250 years from now. But there are letters I wish I had. We do had some letters that one of my great whatever grandparents wrote from the Civil War, and they were written in German because this was someone who had fled the Germany after the 1848 revolution, but wound up in the Civil War. And you think, oh, wonderful, we have letters from the Civil War. But it turns out they say things like, wife, please send more warm socks. you know, uh, wife send what, but they're very moving to me that people cared enough and thought enough to kind of tuck these away and save them, and that we get to see them, this little picture of people's lives, even if some of them do say, wife send warm socks.
Well, if you got a letter from T.S. Eliot, you'd probably tend to save it. Yeah, that's cool.
I want to say that, first of all, I apologize for coming in late. Leslie, that was lovely. I love cats. And maybe somebody already said this, I don't know, but I'm just coming in late too, and you were already reading it. And I thought, oh, yeah, whoa, is this T.S. Eliot? I had that, like, whoa, we're talking. And it kind of reminded me of a modern artist who does these really intricate pencil drawings just to remind you that he or she can draw.
Mm.
There's a whimsical rhyme to it. There's a rhythm, like, stopping, whose wits these are. I think I know, whose cat this is. He's a crazy, it's got a rhythm that a lot of really traditional poets had, even, some of William Blake. And so just to realize that he can write that also is, I think, just a little bit of a tour de force. That's just, I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. Were you gonna say something?
But yeah, he's got a little skill, that guy.
He's doing okay. Absolutely. Are we ready to move on to William Carlos Williams or? Yeah, good. Leslie, that was wonderful.
Yeah,
Um,
thanks
that
thanks
was
again. That was
fun.
terrific.
Thanks. That was
Give her
great.
a hand, yay. A Zoom hand, yay.
Hey.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks, Leslie.
that was nice. That's great. Okay, so William Carlos Williams is about as different from T.S. Eliot as a person could be. And I always think of the two of them in some ways as um, exemplifying the course of poetry in the United States in the 20th and then into the 21st century. T.S. Eliot really was a defining arbiter of taste, not only for his own poetry, but for a lot of people writing up until around 1960, with the new critics and with Eliot's enormous influence and enormous brilliance and his essays in tradition and the individual talent, Hamlet and his problems, and then all of Eliot's writings about the role of the university and the role of belief and the role of religion and so on. Eliot just had an enormous, enormous influence on poetry and also on academic studies. So, as I'm sure you guys remember in English courses when we were coming up through, we read Eliot. I read Eliot every year in classes, and it would be like sort of a slightly more difficult poem every year, working our way through Eliot's group of poetry. I never read Williams except in junior high. I had a teacher who, with regard to the Red Wheelbarrow poem, did this. She said, make your fingers like this, look through them. What do you see? That's like the Red Wheelbarrow poem. And then we moved on. Next poet, Ezra Pound. I never encountered Williams in classes, English classes, even though I was an English geek. And then finally in grad school, I read an essay by J. Hillis Miller about Williams's concept of the imagination that just blew me out of the water. And I decided, okay, this is somebody that I want to spend time with. The next 10 years of my life, I wrote a dissertation on William Carlos Williams. And finally, when I became pregnant with my third child, I went in to tell Spengeman that I was having another baby. And he said, couldn't you please just have a chapter? It's like, can we get this moving and get you out of here? It took a while. But okay, so I want to talk about Williams's life and talk about his great influence on poetry and writing and our concepts of poetry in the 20th and 21st centuries. So Williams was born in 1883. Our son Caleb was born on Williams's 100th birthday. And my mom said, my goodness, you do have a connection with that man, don't you? Um, he was born in Rutherford, New Jersey. And although he did travel, and he did for a while spend several months living in Europe with a deliberate test to see whether he wanted to become an expatriate writer. Instead, he chose to remain in Rutherford, New Jersey. This was a very deliberate choice, and he had a lot of reasons for doing so. He was born to Elena Hoheb, who was Puerto Rican. She was partly Jewish, partly Dutch, partly Spanish. She was from Puerto Rico. Her first language was Spanish, which is where we get the Carlos in his name. And to William George Williams, who was British and never became a U.S. subject. William George Williams was born to a woman named Emily Dickinson, not related to the poet Emily Dickinson, who had left England. I'm pretty sure she was an unwed mother. And he met his wife, Elena, in Puerto Rico, and then they settled in Rutherford. He was a traveling salesman for the cologne called Florida Water. Williams had a brother, a slightly younger brother, and the two of them were like kind of like Eliot as a kid, extremely dutiful. The children of, Victorian era parents, church going, responsible, good students, good citizens, and so on. Williams at one point said that he honored his father and mother, and he never wanted to do anything that would displease them.
Hmm.
So Williams grew up and decided to go to medical school straight out of high school. At that time, you could enter medical school as a med student without getting a BA first. He enrolled in the University of Pennsylvania. While he was there, he became really good friends with the poet Ezra Pound and also with the poet Hilda Doolittle, who was known as H.D. Williams and Pound hung out a lot. Williams was writing poetry, and his early poetry is Whilom I spent upon a day It's that kind of poetry, drifting upon a leafy bower, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He had very kind of late Victorian tastes in poetry, very genteel. But he and Pound was writing a sonnet a day and challenging Williams to duels, wearing a velvet cape and so on and so forth. And Williams and HD were spending a lot of time together as well. So Williams was writing poetry, but mostly putting it into his desk drawer. An early poem of his is copied on Keats's poem Endymion. And this was actually it's a reason I'm an English professor. I found this poem. It's long and it's not good, but it's a very early kind of coded portrait of the artist as a young man. And I wrote a chapter about it that became a chapter in my dissertation. It's an interesting story. Anyway, okay, then Williams also, he and his brother Ed fell in love with the same girl, a very beautiful young lady. And Ed said to Williams, "Why don't you go and propose for both of us?" And Williams said, "Okay, I'll do that." So he went to her house, to Charlotte's house, and he said, "We'd both like to marry you. Which would you choose?" And she said, "Oh, I'll choose Ed." And so Williams went home and grieved for 3 days. He tells this, it's sort of like the 3 days in the tomb. And then he picked himself up, walked down the stairs, walked out the door, went to their house, and proposed to her younger sister, Flossie. And Flossie said, "Well, and I'm paraphrasing this, of course, but she's kind of like, I've really kind of had a thing for you for a long time, so give me a while to think about it." So Ed had received a really important prize for being an architecture student, and he was going to spend a year in Rome under the Prix de Rome. Williams's father said to him, "I will send you abroad also to Germany to study medicine." So Williams went off to Germany, studied medicine for a year, came back, and Flossie said, okay. They were married in 1912. They had two sons, another William Williams, and a son, Paul. William Williams became a doctor like his father, lived in the same house as an adult in Rutherford, New Jersey. So Williams became a doctor. He was still writing, but he chose to stay in Rutherford because he wanted to take part in an American Renaissance. He did not want to decamp, and this is like one of the most important things about him. He was traveling a lot to New York City to hang out with people like he was friends with Wallace Stevens. He was friends with the photographer Alfred Stieglitz. He was friends with Georgia O'Keeffe. He was still friends with HD and Pound, but they had moved to Europe. He was friends with all these other poets who are not as well known as he is now, and they were all wanting to, and with the dancer Martha Graham, and with so many different artists working in the early part of the 20th century to get something going in the United States for the United States, sort of in the tradition of Whitman, who said, America, well, Emerson said, America is a poem in our eyes. Whitman said, I want my writing to be in American English, not British English, not the King's English. And this is a super important thing about Williams. Williams also made very deliberate choices about his medical practice. He chose not to become a doctor in New York City, although he had several invitations to do so. He chose not to become, at one point, Pound wanted him to stay in Europe, travel to Europe, stay there, and become a doctor there. And he chose not to do that. He chose to return to the States and create a medical practice. Now, he was the chief resident at Patterson General Hospital. So, he did have a sort of medical practice among the bourgeoisie of Rutherford and Patterson, New Jersey. But he also was a doctor to the poor, to people who would come and pay him in chickens or in yard work or in, some kind of manual labor. He would go out on calls. He would deliver babies on people's sagging beds. He would perform appendectomies. Well, no, that was a generation earlier. He did not actually perform appendectomies on kitchen tables, but he knew doctors who did that. He was an OBGYN. He delivered over 2,000 babies. I've met people who were delivered by William Carlos Williams. He was a pediatrician. He was the pediatrician for the Rutherford Public Schools. And I've seen poems that he wrote on the back of, like school slips, Billy charged out at 12:12 to blah, 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 blah. And he also was a GP. So he had this really wide, kind of old-fashioned medical practice with, you could say, several specializations. He had his office, his medical office across the hall from the dining room. So he would, get up from the dinner table and go see patients. He had the kind of desk where you could pull out a shelf, and he had a typewriter bolted to that shelf. So in between patients, he could pull out the typewriter and write a poem.
Hmm.
He wrote the Red Wheelbarrow poem, apparently at a red stoplight. You know, Somebody said something like, "How long did it take you to write that?" And he said, like 15 seconds, you know. So he had also, up in his attic in his house, he was set up to be a writer there, and he wrote about that attic. So Williams's attitude toward art, he said, the dream is in pursuit. He said that late in his life. The dream is in pursuit. His attitude was of constant creativity. He, unlike Eliot, Williams had a vastly profuse outpouring. There are something like 40,000 pages of, Williams's documents at Yale and also at Buffalo. I've seen some of them. He published not only poetry, but also short stories. He wrote 3 novels about his wife. He published a really important book of essays called In the American Grain that came out in 1925. He published plays. And he also published Patterson, which is a 5-part, 240-page poem that he calls his American epic. And he says it's a counter to Greek and Latin. He says it was built by the bare hands. So Williams is, as I said, his outpouring is just, his output is just enormous. And the thing about it is that some of it is really great. I mean, he wrote some of the greatest short lyric poems in American poetry. Some of it is good, some of it is bad, and there's not this desire to prune that we see in a poet like Eliot. I mean, I really admire Eliot's pruning. I admire the fact that I can look at my shelf and see, T.S. Eliot complete poems and plays, and it's a book like, that thick. But I also admire that Williams is just living a life of productivity. Another thing to say about Williams, 2 more things I want to say. First of all, he was incredibly supportive of other artists. There's this really funny story. I can't remember who it was, Alva Turner or somebody, a minor poet, walking down the street, meets another minor poet and says, "Oh, wow, Bill Williams just told me that I was the next Homer." And this other guy says, "Yeah, he told me the same thing too." You know? So he's like an enthusiast. I mean, Williams was an enthusiast. He would loan other poets money. He would help them start tiny, tiny little magazines so that they could get published and he could get published. He would champion their output. He would review them. He would support them. He would introduce them to people. He just was really throwing his. Allen Ginsberg has a great line in one of his poems, "I'm throwing my queer shoulder behind the wheel." And Williams threw his very much not queer shoulder behind the wheel of artistic production in 20th century United States. And then the other thing to say about him is that he was breaking all the rules. He writes in his autobiography, "I decided to become a doctor so that I never had to try to make money at my writing." And that's because he did not want to be confined to anybody else's expectations for what poetry should sound like or should be about. So he's a free verse poet. He can rhyme. In a beautiful poem called The Yachts, there is rhyme. But he is very much a free verse poet. He's very much an experimental poet. No longer seen so much in terms of experimentation because he has defined the taste by which others read him, if that makes sense, just like Emily Dickinson did, you know. He is um, also, I would say, mostly a short form poet. So, like, you know, when I was looking through what poems I wanted to send you just for his early poems, they're mostly really small. When I was in my defense of my dissertation, one of my professors said to me, so do you think of him as a great poet? Like a great poet, you know, capital G, great. And I'm like, yes, I do. And they're like, make an argument for it. The argument that you have to make is different from an argument that you'd make for, let's say, Wordsworth or T.S. Eliot or, you know, Shakespeare, for instance. But Williams's, I think, greatness lies in the overallness of his productivity, the overallness of what he accomplished as an artist. So I want to backtrack just a little bit. Because he was breaking all the rules, because he was not following anything that would define, you know, what poetry should sound like or should be like or should be written for, he was not a success in the first decades of his poetic career. One reason that he was supporting other people who wanted to set up printing presses or other people who wanted to set up tiny magazines is that he needed these to get published. He was putting money into his own publications to get published because, you know, he was a doctor. He was living in Rutherford, for God's sake, not even New York City, not even Paris or Rome or London. He was living in Podunkville. He was, you know, taking care of children with runny noses. And people just did not think of him. They didn't know how to read him. We mentioned some time ago the Armory show, this first showing of Cubism that came to America in, I think it was 1912. Williams and his friends with this New York Renaissance, you know, were all excited about it. But generally, the American viewing public felt that it was deeply immoral and that it wasn't art.
It's 13.
1913, thank you. Same with Williams. So he did not have a regular publisher until the 1940s. And this is a cool story. James Laughlin, who was a very wealthy son of steel money, graduated from Princeton and traveled to Europe to meet Ezra Pound. And he called on Ezra Pound and he said, you know, I would like you, would you be willing to read some of my poetry? And Pound said, sure. So Pound read it and Pound said, and again, I'm paraphrasing, well, you're not that great a poet, but you're really rich. So what you should do is go to the United States and start a publishing company. And James Laughlin said, okay. So he went back to the States and he founded New Directions Publishing, which is now still one of the most distinguished publishing companies in the United States. And it's always had a reputation for publishing, you know, number one, foreign writers, but number two, experimental writers, writers who are not just sort of part of the commercial, you know, mainstream. Laughlin wrote to Williams and said, I'm a fan. I will publish anything you write from now on. So he became Williams's publisher, but this is not till the 1940s. Till then, Williams had been, you know, publishing here and there and hither and yon, and had been writing what are now considered to be some of the most important books in 20th century American literature, especially the 1923 book called Spring and All, and the 1925 collection of essays in the American Grain. But there were other books as well. So, okay, that's a little bit about Williams. Williams went on writing. He did not write much poetry during the 1930s. He was working mostly on short stories and on this trilogy of novels about his wife's childhood. His wife was the daughter of a German immigrant family. And Williams was writing about their struggle to get started in America, their struggle to become successful financially. In the 1940s, he'd had the idea since the 19 teens of wanting to write this long poem called called Patterson, which would be the poem of Paterson, New Jersey. And it would be the poem of the Passaic River and the Passaic Falls. Alexander Hamilton had referred to the Passaic River as an incredibly valuable hydroelectric, possibly, well, not yet, but an incredibly valuable possible water power center. Yeah. And so it was developed. It was the site of some really important labor strikes in the early 20th century, and it had been commercialized and it had been developed from what had been a site that was so beautiful and so bucolic that it was kind of second only to Niagara Falls, as a honeymoon destination or as a destination for painters to paint, into this, degraded, commercialized, overdeveloped site of labor struggle and of industrialization. Williams wanted to write about that. He wanted to write about the history of it. He wanted to write about the people of it. He wanted to write using also a lot of documentation, a lot of, quoting directly from historical documents and so on. So he worked on this poem called Paterson, which is, as I said, in 5 books. And we'll get to it eventually. We'll read part of it. The first part of it came out early in the 40s. He was still working on it all through the 40s and into the 1950s. But another thing to mention is that during the late 40s and then into the 50s, he had a series of really serious health setbacks, both in the form of strokes and in the form of heart attacks. So by the time he wrote his autobiography, he thought that that was going to be the end of his writing career. He thought that he was going to just kind of stop, you know. But he went through a pretty severe depression in the early 50s. And one of the reasons for that is this. Williams, who had struggled, I mean, I've been rereading just some short biographical stuff about him. And I mean, this man's courage to keep working as an artist when sometimes his entire output as far as royalties would be like, $40 over 2 years. When he was, paying to get his stuff published, when he was just not really visible for such the longest time. And when he was trying to help other people get this thing going to oppose all the attention on the expatriates, to oppose the colossal reputation of Eliot. He said, Eliot set us back to the Stone Age in far as what we were trying to get going. This man's courage is just amazing. And so finally in the 40s and then in the early 50s, he started getting some recognition. The poet Robert Lowell reviewed Patterson Book 1 and talked about its importance, and so he was starting to get some recognition from mainstream American writers too. And then he was appointed to this enormous honor, which would now be called Poet Laureate of the United States, but then it was called the Poet Consultant to the Library of Congress. He received this honor. But this, what, capital starts with a B, in Virginia, who published a little magazine, accused Williams of communism. Williams, who had sons in the army during World War II, Williams, who was, kind of a little ardent Democrat, but also would write blurbs for socialist writers. He was on the side of the workers and so on. To be accused of being a Red caused the Library of Congress to renege on that honor. He and Flossie, by this time, he was like, it was hard for him to get around. They traveled several times to Washington, D.C., so that he could testify, so that he could plead his case. The year passed. He'd never received that honor. They did not renew it. And this was like a really bitter blow to this man. Also, there were other causes as well, his own health and so on. So he sort of entered a pretty severe depression and was even at a clinic for some weeks in the early 50s. Out of this emerged the late poetry. And Williams's late poetry is sort of one of the great late poetry acts in poetic history. It was think about the Romantic poets whose poetic output, even if they managed to survive, really fell off after their 30s, including Wordsworth. Think about Keats was dead, Byron was dead, Shelley was dead. Poetry as an old person has really been a challenge. There have been even books written about this, how to become an old poet and remain creative and keep doing great work. And Williams is one of those who kept doing great work. And in fact, some of his most beautiful poetry of all is late poetry. He developed a form that he called the triadic line, and it's a stair-step line. And we'll look at examples of it when we get there. He felt that this form was, a really important new measure. One of the things that helped him do was keep track of where he was on the page. Because as I said, he'd had strokes. He was impaired. He was visually impaired. And with this triadic line, which is a very beautiful flowing line, and you'll see how it can work, it just enabled him to see, what the heck he was doing, right? So he went on writing these beautiful, beautiful poems that are collected posthumously in a book that won the Pulitzer Prize called Pictures from Bruegel.
I don't think it's posthumous.
Yeah, it is posthumous. Yeah. He also was writing poems about, as the title would indicate, the painter Bruegel, with whom he powerfully identified. He was doing this beautiful work. He wrote Book 5 of Patterson, and then he died in 1963. But what I love is that the Beat poets took Williams as their father figure. They adored this guy. And there's great stories. There's a really good biography of Williams by Paul Mariani called William Carlos Williams, A New World Naked. And he tells the story of how these beat poets would like climb in their cars and go drive across the country to go visit Williams. And he says Williams would be like, "What's that you're smoking in the kitchen? I don't approve of that odor. It smells like oregano," And he was like the old geezer. But there's a beautiful story about Williams's funeral. Because, Williams, by this time, he was like a highly respected citizen of Rutherford, New Jersey. So at his funeral, he died in March. There were all these doctors and lawyers and important citizens there. And then all of a sudden, this big car pulls up, and all these old beat poets come pouring out. And they've been, driving hell-bent for leather to get there, too. So Williams's reputation has just been growing since the 1940s. It's been incredibly important, not only to the Beats, but to so many poets who write now. Gary Snyder, Adrian Rich, Louise Glick talks about Williams and Eliot as the two poets writing in English who had the biggest influence on her work. I would say Williams has been an enormous influence on me, obviously, and on so many people I know who write in free verse and who insist that poetry, Williams says, and here again I'm paraphrasing, but it's pretty close to accurate, poetry can be made of anything as long as it is seen, felt, apprehended by the senses, and understood to be what it is, part of a continually reviving permanence. So poetry can be made of anything. You don't have to have fancy topics to write poetry. Poetry can be made. Williams wrote a poem about his wife's bedroom slippers. He wrote a poem about parsley in a glass of water. He wrote a poem about schoolgirls walking down the street with lollipops. He wrote a really eloquent poem about a poor old woman dying, moaning, "I can't die, I can't die." Poetry can be made out of what's happening right here, right now, where you are, what you see. what you experience. As long as it is apprehended by the senses, it cannot be made out of vague abstractions. It's got to be apprehended by what you see, what you taste, what you hear, what you smell. You're going to be reading a poem called Smell by Williams. What you feel. And then there's this larger claim too, part of the continually repeated permanence. It's not only, it might seem like it's only of the moment, but it's not. Those schoolgirls walking down the street with their lollipops like bright flames are, you know, schoolgirls through time, on hot streets through time. Parsley in a glass. Sure, it's parsley in a glass, but it's, and then he writes, this great poem. This is just to say I've eaten the plums that you were saving in the icebox, and we'll talk about that next time. But it's like this constantly repeated permanence, which is also the local. Williams kept saying through his whole life, no ideas, but in things. And that's not the same as saying no ideas, but it's saying ideas must be grounded in things, in the physical world, in the world of the body, in the tactile world, in the world that we actually live in. So that's my very brief introduction to Williams. Williams is a really fascinating person. He was a complicated person. He was by no means a perfect person. One of the things that he had to come to terms with late in his life is infidelity. And that's one of the reasons for the late poetry. Is something that he writes about pretty honestly and struggles with. Another thing that he had to come to terms with is his incredible envy of T.S. Eliot. There's an interesting triangulation between Williams, Eliot, and Pound, because, of course, Pound and Eliot were very close friends, but Pound and Williams were also close friends. Williams wrote about Eliot. He's like the little dog biting at the heels of the big dog. And here's what Eliot said about Williams. Ah, Williams, a poet of some local interest, perhaps. And that's all he said about Williams, So there's this like great rivalry going on, which is a one-sided rivalry. And it's not that there are no longer great formalist poets. There are still poets working pretty much within an Eliotic tradition, but it's that Williams has really had his day as well, starting sort of in the late 40s and then continuing especially in the 50s and 60s with the beat poets, with eco poets, and with poets and creative nonfiction writers who stress the importance of place. Williams is all about place. He's all about exactly where he was when he was writing about it. So, I love this guy. Okay, anybody want to talk about Williams for a couple minutes so far? Questions?
I just did a search, and you can on Passaic Falls, and there's a lot of images of Passaic Falls. It's really pretty cool.
Yeah, really beautiful in the olden days.
On the subject of age, Wordsworth, I think, was in his early 30s when he wrote Intimations of Immortality, which is all about getting so old that nothing means anything to you anymore. And also, I already mentioned that Thomas wrote Rage Against the Dying of the Light when he was 33.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Doesn't anybody think about getting old? All these poets, don't they think about getting old when they're actually old?
Well, Williams, you'll find out, Williams Stevens, people like Stanley Kunitz lived to be 100, and he was writing some really beautiful poems till then, But it's been a struggle because so much of what everybody thought poetry should be about is this kind of early blazing inspiration, young passion, and so on and so forth. And so, and so, and so,
There was a time when almost all the books that I was getting were either New Directions or City Lights. When
amazing.
Oh,
Ferlinghetti hung in there, till he was over 100. Peter, what were you gonna say, honey?
Wordsworth writes in the prelude, which can't be dated because there's an 1805 version and an 1850
Right.
version. I see by glimpses now when age comes on may scarcely see at all. And I think those are very moving lines. And he wrote so much great poetry by the time he was in his early
Yeah.
30s. Um, he continued to have a really beautiful style and a very fine mind and a lot of integrity, but I think he lost the feeling that he had some real need to write or something to write about. And in the late poems, you kind of see that for most of them, nothing much is happening. There are a few great late poems of Wordsworth's, and one of them that Harold Bloom points out is called Composed Upon an Evening of Extraordinary Splendor and Beauty. And he writes, This glimpse of glory, why renewed?
Oh God. Oh Lord.
So, that's a legitimate thing to happen
Yeah.
too. And he is one of the greatest poets.
Yeah.
But when you say that's a legitimate thing to happen, Peter, what do you mean?
Yeah, that's a good point. I just mean that you can go on writing because you have a renewed inspiration or a continued inspiration, which I think is true of Yeats for
Yeah.
sure in old
Yates for sure.
age, and of Williams and of a few others. Or you can just go on writing because it's a habit and you can still do it, which I think is more or less true of most of the late poems of Tennyson and Browning, for example, most of the late poems of Wordsworth. Though again, there are beautiful exceptions. Crossing the Bar is one of the greatest things Tennyson ever wrote, and it's from his old age. But if your inspiration fails, you can either go on without it or decide not to go on.
Yeah.
I think I'm among it. It's not. It's probably a minority, but I'm among the people who think that Dylan didn't do anything much about afternoon warning. And somebody's going to kill me for saying that, but
After
it
which
seemed
one?
new morning, or even before that.
Uh, See,
And
Go ahead.
I think he's great later than that, at least through Blood on the Tracks and, at times in even later ones. But it's true that I tend to lose interest in Dylan's poems after 1975. So I'm not too far from what you said.
I know I'm offending people, but
No, you're
as
not
somebody
offended.
somebody who loved Blood on the Tracks was just so horrified that I didn't it didn't do it for me. But yeah, it was like New Morning was about it as far as, and maybe not even that. But it is an interesting thing about age, and I wonder if Wordsworth could have smoked a joint when he was 70. That well, I don't know. I mean, who knows? But
Yeah.
maybe it would have refreshed his immediacy. Immediacy of experience.
Of course, wasn't Eliot was in his 60s with Little Gidding,
No, late 50s.
late 50s. I'm so bad at math. Sorry,
See,
guys.
I think Wordsworth, when you consider the steadiness of his mind and his habits and so on, it's amazing that he was as great a poet as he was for the 15 or 20 years for which he was a great poet. I don't think something had faded from him, but I think he was the same man more or less all the way through. And I used to think Byron was right, he was a turncoat because he became a Tory, but a lot of his feelings were Tory and they were sort of liberal Tory. He said, I have something of the Chartist in me, but I don't like the Whigs. You know, it, it just, I don't know that he had much choice. I don't know that poets do have much choice.
Um, I'm also interested in the process. I'm sorry to bring this up. I know it's pretentious of me to even delve into this area, but I've written a lot of songs, and it's such a different process. Williams, the idea that you would just have an impression, a sense impression of a particular moment and try to capture that is not at all how songwriting goes. Uh, it
Yeah.
is,
Yeah.
and I imagine it's not what Eliot did either, and a lot of people did, and Shakespeare. I don't imagine Shakespeare was just trying to capture a moment he was living in. He was creating a whole story and a whole bunch of characters and all. So what I'm saying is it's a kind of a peculiar kind of writing from my point of view that you just try to capture this moment and then you say that was so influential on the beats.
Well, I forgot to mention imagism. I mentioned that HD and Pound moved to Europe, and HD for a time was married to Richard Aldington, another poet. And they got together and they decided very deliberately that they would write poetry. And I should have written this down, but it's what is it? Can't remember what they are. The rules for an imagist.
Pound said that. Pound had a three-step thing of rules for, I think they were for
Yeah,
imagism.
they are.
One, direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective or objective. And I can't remember what the second and
Yeah.
third were, but basically no padding.
Yeah, no padding. And language should sound as it's actually used by real people, you know. I'll look those up for next time if I remember to do so. But and Williams is an imagist poet in his early poetry sometimes too. Now, imagism, it's 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 a mistake, I think, to take it too rigidly. There are great imagist poems. You know, for instance, The Red Wheelbarrow is an imagist poem. It's an image. Pounds on a station in the metro, the apparition of these stations in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. It's a great imagist poem that he cut down from a much longer poem. HD's poem, Oriad, imagist poem, and there are others. But what the imagists are emphasizing is in order to get away from the kind of rambling, rhyming abstractions of a lot of not very good Georgian poetry, you know, and poetic sentiments with sort of quotation marks around that phrase. They want to return to, again, this tactile emphasis, this emphasis on, you know, the things that the senses grasp, right? Um, Douglas, were you raising your hand? No? Okay,
it
okay.
it seems like Eliot is requiring a lot of his audience because he wants to be understood as having this wide historical and philosophical range. And so he has these references that try to bring that out. But he's asking a lot of you that you know something about Hinduism, for example.
Yeah,
That's asking a lot from the reader. On the other hand, this is the other side of asking a lot from the reader because you're just giving them an image and then almost asking them to fill in the because if it's just a physical image, you're asking them to fill in the meaning. And as opposed to just, I mean, for example, Shakespeare, he gives you a story. You know, if you follow the language, you're taken along by Shakespeare. You don't have to you don't have to know anything about Julius Caesar, you know, to enjoy Shakespeare. But these guys are both asking a lot. And saying those two guys, for example, are asking a lot of the audience. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I remembered Pound's other two rules.
Oh, good.
To compose in sequence of the musical phrase, not in sequence of the metronome, and to use absolutely no word which does not contribute to the presentation, which,
You know,
that's no
yeah,
padding.
yeah, yeah. So that takes us back to the sentence, back to the image, you know, rather than the dida 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 like that, you know, it just takes us back. Yeah, I mean, Williams is not an easy poet. He's not an easy poet. You can read it, some of his poems and they're like, whoa, that's easy. That's, you know, simple. But for instance, I want next time to emphasize or to spend time with um, the Red Wheelbarrow, sure, but also with This Is Just to Say, and also especially with By the Road to the Contagious Hospital. Um, and you know, there's a lot that if we slow down, again, slow down and pay attention to these poems, there's just a whole lot that's going to kind of flower. I mean, Williams is such an organic poet. And so this metaphor of flowering, I think, is really at the heart of what he does. You know, he's so grounded in the physical world. He's so grounded. He loved flowers. He loved the earth. He loved um, bodies. And, you know, when you're reading that, you're going to see this. Who is it? Somebody, oh, Burke. Kenneth Burke. Yeah, after, or wrote an essay about Williams and said for Williams, the erotic was like a sixth sense. And he doesn't just mean lustiness, but he means this sense of loving going forward toward the world. And he tells this wonderful story about Williams and him. They were good friends and they were walking on the beach one day and they saw a dog that had a thorn in its paw. And Kenneth Burke said, you know, what I would have done is maybe nothing or whatever, but what Williams did is pick up this dog's paw and just really tenderly feel around in it and find the paw and remove the thorn. You know, and he said, to me, that's the essence of this man, you know. So anyway, any other comments before we leave? Okay. Have a good weekend.
See you
See you.
Tuesday.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
You. Thanks, everybody. And thanks again, Leslie.